We are exploring the nature of moral responsibility, the circumstances under which somebody is morally responsible. And we're assuming some familiarity with that discussion amongst philosophers. David Widerker here is responding to Harry Frankfurt's attack on the principle of alternative possibilities. And Widerker is a libertarian, and so he is defending libertarians against libertarianism against this attack. And so we start with the principle of alternative possibilities, this principle that seems to be intuitively true, that a person is morally responsible for performing a given act only if he could have acted otherwise. And so if you're walking with a group of friends and you pass another group of friends and one of your friends takes your arm and smacks one of the other people in the other group, well, we don't hold you responsible for that action. We hold the person who grabbed your arm and did it, right? You couldn't have done otherwise. You couldn't have resisted. It happened so fast. So you're only morally responsible if you were to whack the other person on your own, and you could have refrained from doing that, right? Just to use a silly little example. Now, Widerker's goal is to show that Frankfurt's attack on this principle of alternative possibility, and again, I'm assuming that you're somewhat familiar with that attack, although we'll review that reasoning here. His aim is to show that that attack doesn't succeed, so the principle of alternative possibilities is true, and he's focusing in particular, on mental actions such as deciding or choosing or the process of forming an intention, maybe. We'll clarify that a little bit more in part 2. But Widerker says these are the acts that are the loci of when we are morally responsible for something. It's when we make that decision to do it. That's what makes us morally responsible. So in the previous example, in the first case, your friend just grabbed your arm. You didn't make that decision to whack the person coming from the other group. But in the second case, I suggest, if you did it freely, you decided to do that. You just decided to start something, apparently. Okay, now there are 3 assumptions that Widerker has here. First of all, of course, he is a libertarian. And this is certainly not a definition of libertarianism, but these are some aspects that Widerker thinks are essential to libertarianism. And that means that the agent's choice is free, in the sense required for moral responsibility, only if it's not causally determined, so that libertarianism is inconsistent with causal determinism. So that is certainly an essential part of libertarianism. And in the circumstances in which the agent made the decision, he could have avoided making it. So this is the part that he's connecting libertarian thought with something like the principle of alternative possibilities. He's assuming that that seems to be true. Now, the action in the principle of alternative possibilities, in order for this to work, in order for it to make sense, it refers to an action such that the agent was aware that he was performing it, and he believed, at least, that he could have done otherwise, right? Now, another assumption that Widerker has is a fine-grained account of action individuation, and we'll see the importance of this when we get to part 2. Okay, so here's a review of Frankfurt's plan of attack to show that the PAP is false. So Frankfurt argues for the IRR. Now, Widerker doesn't explain what IRR stands for, and it's not clear from Frankfurt what it's supposed to stand for. So maybe I would suggest a irresistible reason for acting. I don't know. But in any case, we're going to call this principle the IRR because that's what Widerker does. And it is that there may be circumstances in which a person performs some action which, although the circumstances make it impossible for him to avoid performing that action, they in no way bring it about that he performs it. And those are cases where the person is going to be held morally responsible, even though he couldn't have done otherwise, which would be a problem for the libertarian and also, of course, problematic for the principle of alternative possibilities. And Frankfurt defends this IRR by describing what I call FSEs, or Frankfurt-style examples, of course. And it's not necessarily Frankfurt's own at this point in the dialogue. Certainly John Martin Fisher has developed these Frankfurt-style examples, so Widerker is responding to kind of a accumulated view of what an FSE is, and they are going to be examples that we started with Frankfurt using the two characters Jones and Black. Okay, so in order to make this clear, we want to make sure we're clear about the Frankfurt-style example, and we want to get the details down clearly. So we're going to follow what Widerker has here. And the idea now is Jones is pondering whether or not to kill Smith. And if Jones is blushing at a time T1, and then provided no one intervenes at a later time T2, Jones will decide to kill Smith. Now, there's also another sign here. If Jones is not blushing at T1, then as long as no one intervenes, Jones will not decide at T2 to kill Smith. Now, Black wants Jones to kill Smith. And so if Black sees that Jones shows signs that he will not decide at T2 to kill Smith, in other words, he shows he's not blushing, then in that case, then Black's going to intervene. Black's going to force Jones to decide at T2 to kill Smith. How? We don't know. Overwhelming threat, maybe neural intervention, maybe Black's a neuroscientist that's implanted something in Jones's brain. We don't need to worry about that. We'll just assume that that's a capacity that Black has. Black can do that. But if Black sees that Jones is blushing at T1, and so he's going to decide to kill Smith at T2 anyway, then Black does nothing, right? He doesn't intervene. Now, suppose Black's observing, he sees that Jones is blushing at T1, and then in fact, Jones decides at T2 to kill Smith for reasons of his own, for Jones's own reason, that is. And so that's our situation. Frankfurt thinks that this is an IRR situation, right? It is a case where these are circumstances such that Jones is performing the action, Black's going to assure that he performs the action, Black's the one making it impossible to avoid it, but Black doesn't bring it about that Jones did the action. Black doesn't bring it about that Jones kills Smith. So this seems to be an IRR situation that shows that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. Now, here we have the question at hand. Has Frankfurt succeeded? Now, again, when Widerker talks about refuting libertarianism, we're assuming the broader idea of libertarianism that includes both free will and moral responsibility. Okay, so let's think it through. Consider this case. Jones blushing at T1 can't be causally sufficient for his decision to kill Smith. And that's because such an assumption would be neither in accordance with the IRR, right? Because then it's what's making the action happen, and we don't want that. Nor would it be something that's accepted by the libertarians. So the libertarian's going to say, well, that's, of course, the person's not morally responsible in such a situation because there's causal determinism going on. So you can't have that. Okay, so, but if one is not so grounded, that is, if Jones is blushing at T2 is not causally sufficient for him to decide to kill Smith at T2, the blushing at T1 is not causally sufficient to cause the decision to kill at T2, then there are two options available to the libertarian. Okay, to resist this contention, how does the libertarian rather respond? Okay, first option, you reject one by claiming, look, the only thing that would be permissible from the libertarian's perspective in order to make this refutation of the PAP convincing is that Jones, there's a probability connection. So if Jones is blushing at T1, then Jones will probably decide at T2 to kill Smith. So that's how you remove that causal sufficiency that undermines the whole purpose of the Frankfurt style example. You make it probability. But wait a minute, 1A that includes probability is compatible with Jones having the power to decide not to kill Smith. And that means the action was not unavoidable. And so the Frankfurt style example fails. It doesn't show that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. Now, the other option for the libertarian is to take the path of saying, well, here's 1B. If Jones is blushing at T1, then Jones will freely decide at T2 to kill Smith. Now, this might get into some interesting details about free actions, and Widerker refers to Plantinga on this, and that's probably an important reference, but we can't go into all the details there. Suffice it to say that just like in 1A, that would mean that he could have decided to refrain even after blushing at T1, could have refrained from killing Smith and making the decision to kill Smith even after blushing at T1. So there seems to be this dilemma for Frankfurt. So this is Widerker's position, his conclusion. Frankfurt's in this situation of having a problematic dilemma. Either the truth of that one is grounded in some fact that is causally sufficient for Jones's decision at T2 to kill Smith, or it's not. And we've talked through the options here. If it is causally sufficient, then we don't have an IRR situation. We don't have this case where there's not something causally intervening to force Jones. The causal sufficiency is there. But if it's not causally sufficient, then Jones's decision is not unavoidable. Jones could have still done something else. And so, yes, we hold him responsible, but we claim that he could have done something else from the libertarian perspective. And the first option, of course, he's not morally responsible, and that's because he couldn't have done something else. So the PAP would still be true in either case. The truth of the IRR situation has not been established. Frankfurt fails in his attack on the principle of alternative possibilities. Okay, so Widerker goes on to consider some other objections from the perspective of someone defending Frankfurt, and Widerker goes on to kind of fine-tune his view on actions, but that was something that we'll need to take up in part 2.